Today, we become legends.
With the changes made to penetration in Smite 2 compared to Smite 1, the way you should build your pen has of course changed as well. In Smite 1, percent penetration was spread across many items with a handful of what I call pen bombs that offer more than the usual amount but trade off in other areas. In Smite 2, however, percent penetration only exists on 4 items really, and all of them are bombs rather than small amounts of pen. There is also the void items, but they have a very different use case than these traditional 4% pen bombs, so I won't really be talking about the void items in this video. There are pros and cons to this way of doing penetration in my opinion, and this video isn't really about that, but as a brief aside, the pros of doing the system this way is that it results in less must-build items filling up your item slots. When percent pen is spread across many items, most of the time we just see those items become near essential to build because penetration is arguably the single most powerful stat in the game, with the only one really competing with it being movement speed. So under this new system, you have just one essential item with your Titan's Bane or Obsidian Shard, rather than what was frequently 3 essential percent pen items in Smite 1. As you'd have your Titans or Shard for 20%, then 2 10% pen items to hit the cap of 40. This could be done in 2 items like Serrated Edge plus Titans or Charon's Coin plus Shard, but more often it was done in 3 items. This new system opens up builds a bit more as there's less items you're buying purely to fill your pen requirement. However, as I mentioned, this system does have downsides as well, with the main one being related to the topic of this video. Instead of say gaining 10% pen from your Hydras in 2nd slot, then another 10% from your Crusher in 4th slot, then 20% from your Titan's Bane in 5th slot, you will now just have 0% pen for a long period of the game and immediately spike up to 35% as soon as you finish your Titans or Shard. This leads to very spiky gameplay, where 1 minute you're doing very little damage, but after a single recall, you're suddenly slamming everyone on the map. So yeah, there's upsides and downsides to this system. That's not really what this video is about. Which leads me into the main topic here. You probably aren't building your percent penetration early enough in your build. This came to my mind after seeing people in my ranked games and seeing builds on various build websites and the in-game God Builder where people are recommending to pick up your percent pen bomb in 5th or even 6th slot sometimes. In Smite 1, this was more acceptable because the jump there was going from 20% up to 40, but the jump in Smite 2 is much larger as you're going from 0 to 35. Also, in Smite 1, you would have flat penetration early in your build for mid and jungle, which you sort of have for jungle in Smite 2 with Swan Spear, but mid has no such option. So your power curve is even less smooth in Smite 2 because of the lack of flat pen. You're going from literally no pen whatsoever to extremely high amounts of pen once you finish these items. Also, side note, Swan Spear is such an oddity, man. They make this whole big move in Smite 2 to remove flat pen from the game, but then leave it on one specific jungler item. That's always felt weird to me. If you want to commit to no flat pen in the game, just remove Swan. You probably know by now that I personally will bring flat pen back to the game as I think it was very important for early game pacing for mid and jungle, but if they do want to stick to their guns on the flat pen removal, why does Swan Spear still exist? Hold on a second though guys, because you're not going to want to miss all this free Raid Shadow Legends loot. Stick around to find out how to get it. But you know who also sticks around? The ultimate Death Knight, Raid's no-nonsense tanky boy. This dude is basically my dream hero, I'm not going to lie. He just sits there redirecting all single target attacks and debuffs to him, steals healing from the enemy, debuffs them like a beast, and even heals and shields your own team, just in case an attack gets through that wasn't redirected to him. The ultimate Death Knight is basically there to make sure nothing touches the rest of your party, and it's so satisfying to just plonk him in front of the enemy and watch him go to work. And the best part, you can get the ultimate Death Knight completely for free until March 31st using code UDKING in-game. But of course, there's even more free stuff going around with 2 epic heroes and 1 legendary hero totally for free to help new players get a foothold in Raid. Simply install Raid on mobile, PC, or Mac using my link in the description down below, and you'll get Tagoar of the Orc faction and Tayrel of the High Elves faction once you reach level 15, along with a bunch of other loot to get you started. Add that to the Ultimate Death Knight using promo code UDKING, and you'll have an amazing start to your team. And if you didn't already want to hop into the action, Raid is introducing a massive crossover with a yet-to-be-revealed iconic franchise with exclusive champions, themed events, and limited-time rewards. So hit that link down below or scan the QR code on screen to get straight into the action. Thanks again to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring today's video. Anyway though, as we just saw, the jump from completing Titan's Bane or Obsidian Shard in Smite 2 is absolutely massive, but 35% penetration is just a number and some words. What does this actually mean in terms of your damage output? Let's run a few scenarios. I'm going to be mainly talking about junglers and mid laners here, as ADC builds are a bit different, but a lot of what I state here applies to ADC builds as well. I'll also be starting my tests at 4th slot, since if building Titans or Shard in 4th slot is outperformed, outperforming competing items, you should never be building it later than that anyway, so there's not much point in talking about 5th or 6th slot. So here's the data for building Titans and Shard in 4th slot. This is a lot to take in probably, but here's a brief rundown of what's on this sheet. We have your build first, then the amount of pen in your build, then a pen amount that's normalized between 0 and 1. This column isn't really relevant for you, it just makes the calculations easier for me to run later on. We then have the amount of power in your build, intelligence for the mage section, strength for the assassin section, then the ability I'm using as a benchmark, I chose Scylla 2 and Thor 3 here. We then have the initial damage said ability would do with the specified build, then the target's level and build, the target's procs with said build at level 20, and last we have the final damage you deal after all calculations have gone through. A lot of this is just information to show you how I got to the final numbers. The only columns that really matter for the purposes of this video are the build, the pen amount, the target procs, and the final damage. Starting off with mage builds, the starter and first 3 items are pretty standard, and then in 4th slot we're comparing Obsidian Shard against Rod of Tahuti. As you can see, the final damage output against a squishy target is pretty close, and only slightly favors Rod of Tahuti. Even with 110 less intelligence and hitting a squishy target, Obsidian Shard performs basically on par with Rod of Tahuti in 4th slot. Against tankier targets, Obsidian Shard obviously wins out with noticeably higher damage against these support and solo builds. These quote tank builds were also very conservative in terms of protection amounts. The support build includes Livebinder, which has no procs on it. The solo build includes Devos, a full damage item, as well as Sanguine Lash that isn't very high in procs. So with a more protection heavy build than these, Obsidian Shard becomes even more favored against these tanks. These enemy builds are very much the worst case scenario for these percent pen items performance. For assassins, I once again had a typical first 3 items and starter, and for the comparison we have Titan's Bane versus the Crusher in 4th slot. And just to be extra fair to Crusher, I included its passive damage in the calculation and gave that build an extra tier 1 axe, since Crusher is a bit cheaper than Titan's Bane. Even still, it's not pretty for Crusher here, as we can see that Titans outperforms it even against squishy targets. The difference here isn't huge, but the fact that a 3100 gold percent pen item is outperforming Crusher even against squishies is probably something you didn't expect going into this video. Most of the reason for this is because base physical protections are around 20 points higher than magical protections at level 20 in Smite 2. So for physical gods, percent pen is inherently more valuable. Against tankier targets, Titan's Bane of course outperforms Crusher pretty noticeably, which is to be expected. And again, these tank builds are pretty conservative in their protection amounts, so depending on enemy builds, this could be an even larger outperformance by Titan's Bane. The more procs the enemy has, the better these items become compared to other options. If the enemy has gods that can boost allied procs, this can even make a difference on squishies, for example. If their backliners are getting plus 30 procs from Sylvanas 2, Titan's Bane absolutely clears any other option here against the squishies. Now, obviously, you could poke some holes in these tests, and that's totally fine. Smite is a very dynamic game, and it would be far too time-consuming to test every single possible item combination and scenario of enemy gods and builds. And these tests are just a demonstration of a single but realistic game state. It's also worth noting that I didn't include stuff like Polynomicon or Hydra's procs in these calculations, which might change things a little bit, but both builds have these. The only difference is Rod versus Shard and Crusher versus Titans. Sure, Rod would add some damage to your polyproc, but Shard would boost the polyproc's damage via his pen, so ultimately it would work out pretty similar. This was just one ability though, so I decided it would be worthwhile to also showcase what a full kit dump would look like in these scenarios, so I ran those tests, again using Scylla and Thor. These kit dumps are their entire ability rotation plus 4 basic attacks weaved in. As we can see from this data, the outperformance by the percent pen options actually increases here compared to just the one ability. So we can easily compare these very different damage outputs. I added percent differences here, and as an example, we can see that Titan's Bane against squishies in the one ability test was outperforming by 1.53%, but in the full kit dump it is outperforming by 5.58%. It's similar against tanks, where it goes from around 12% outperformance to around 17%. And the same trend is true of Obsidian Shard, but less extreme, going from 1.04% underperformance against Rod versus Squishies to 0.4%, and a slight increase against tanks as well. This is again because of base magical procs being lower than base physical procs at level 20, and thus the percent pen options perform better there. The reason for these percent pen options getting even better in a full kit dump versus one ability is that base damage ends up factoring in more here. The abilities I chose, being Scylla 2 and Thor 3, are pretty high scaling abilities relative to their base damage, especially Thor 3. A lot of their overall power comes from how much strength or intelligence you have, whereas in their full kits, things swing more towards base damage, which favors the pen items. Since they have lower amounts of power for their cost, but their 35% pen also increases your base damage amounts, which other items will not. Buying a Rod of Tahuti does absolutely nothing for your base damages, whereas buying a shard will increase the base damages pretty substantially in terms of the actual damage that you output. Obviously, it doesn't literally increase the base damage of your abilities, but it increases their effective damage by providing pen against targets. So we've established that building Titans and Shard in 4th slot for mage and jungle builds is at worst viable and at best the way to go. The next logical step is testing it out as a 3rd slot comparison. Here's that data. So 3rd slot is where things start to break a bit, especially for mage builds, since as mentioned before, base magical procs are lower at level 20, and so percent pen is slightly less good for magical characters, especially against squishies. For the mage comparison, I switched up to comparing against Polynomicon instead of comparing against Rod of Tahuti, because 3rd item Rod isn't exactly realistic, and that would be a bit of a disingenuous comparison. This calculation does include the polyproc, since the shard build doesn't have poly anymore, and I also added a tier 1 gem to the poly build to make up for the price difference. I also changed up the target god's level to 15 and 3 items instead of level 20 and 4 items that we were using before. As we can see from the final damage, this is where shard starts to lose out against other options. The poly build here significantly outperforms against squishies and even outperforms against tanks by a decent bit. I will say though, Polynomicon is one of the best items in the entire game right now, and comparing shard against a less crazy item would make it look a little better. Still though, I think we can definitely say that shard 3rd item is pretty troll, given it doesn't even outperform against tanks here. And if it was pitted against a less crazy item than poly, it might just go even against tanks and still outperform pretty heavily against squishies. For assassins, things are a little bit different, again because of that base protection difference. For this one, I continue comparing Titan's Bane against Crusher, because Crusher 3rd item is totally fine and not troll like 3rd item Rod of Tahuti is. Again, I factored in the Crusher proc for the damage calculations and gave that build an extra tier 1 axe to make up for the price difference. As we can see, Crusher 3rd item does outperform Titans against squishies by a tiny bit, but really not as much as you probably thought going into this. And of course, Titans continues to outperform against tanks even in 3rd slot. So in terms of 3rd slot Titan's Bane, I would say it's genuinely pretty viable to do this, especially if you want to hit tankier targets, like if they have a 3-tank team with an Odin jungle or something like that. Of course, junglers ideally aren't looking to target tanks and will want to assassinate enemy squishies, but you honestly don't lose much damage against squishies here anyway. A full kit dump in this 3rd slot comparison looks pretty similar for Obsidian Shard overall, with it ever so slightly swinging towards Shard by around 0.3%, but very little difference. As for Titan's Bane, this does look a little different, as it goes from underperforming against squishies by 0.84% to actually outperforming by 2.47%. A similar increase is seen against tanks, where it goes from 7 to 10% outperformance to 11 to 14%. So in this full kit dump scenario, Titan's Bane is actually strictly better than Crusher in terms of raw damage, even in 3rd slot. As mentioned before though, raw damage numbers aren't everything, and just in this example, Crusher has 15 cooldown rate that Titan's Bane does not. So once again, don't take these numbers as gospel, they're just guidelines. But it is very interesting to see that Titan's Bane 3rd item is outperforming Crusher in terms of raw damage within one kit rotation, even against squishy targets, which is probably not something you would have thought going into this video, right? Also, just adding this in post-recording, because while I was editing this video, the team announced that Polynomicon will be getting heavily nerfed to have an internal cooldown pretty soon, which will nerf the item a lot. Comparing against Poly is the main reason these 3rd slot tests look so bad for Obsidian Shard, and while it would likely still underperform, I wouldn't recommend Shard 3rd or anything like that. It would look a little less troll when you're not comparing against the most broken mage item in the game for raw damage. So yeah, I think what we can glean from these test scenarios is that you should almost always be building Titan's Bane or Obsidian Shard in 4th slot, but building it in 3rd slot is pretty troll, especially for mages. And as mentioned at the start of the video, if these items outperform in 4th slot, there's no sense delaying them any further to 5th or 6th slot. You really want to be building these as early as it makes sense to do so, and from this data, we can see that 4th slot is the earliest point where these items become better than other options overall. I know probably some of you have been wondering about Oathsworn Spear throughout this video and how it factors in, so I ran some numbers on that too. Oathsworn is protection reduction, not penetration, and thus it applies first before your penetration takes effect. This makes the item technically a bit inefficient to build with Titan's Bane, as it takes off 20 of the enemy's procs first, and then Titan's Bane's 35% applies on that smaller number. Whereas if it was actual flat pen, that applies after percent pen, and so it wouldn't be inefficient. But it's just a little bit of inefficiency. It's not something that means you shouldn't build these two items items together, you absolutely should. If we take the 4th slot Crusher and Titan's Bane comparison and sub out Jotun's Wrath for Ulsworn Spear, it does change things slightly. Crusher now outperforms Titan's Bane ever so slightly, whereas it was losing ever so slightly before. Against tanks, it's basically the same, but Titans does get ever so slightly worse thanks to that inefficient interaction between these two items. Titans still outperforms quite a lot though. I would say overall, Titan's Bane 4th item is still the better option, even with Ulsworn Spear in the build, as the squishy damage is barely worse and the tank damage is quite a bit better. Obviously, we can't run this calculation for mages as there's no magical protection equivalent to Ulsworn Spear, but I felt like you guys would have questions about that item, and if anything changes with Ulsworn in the build, and the answer is not really. It swings a tiny bit away from Titans, but not by enough to matter. But yeah, that's the video. I just thought this was worth talking about because I frequently see even good players or good build creators recommending to build your pen in 5th or 6th slot sometimes, which is just troll in my opinion when you look at the actual data. These items really should be in 4th slot unless you have a very good reason to not build them there. Of course, Smite is a very dynamic game and there absolutely could be a scenario where delaying your pen to 5th item is worth doing, but in terms of a general build against a 2-tank team, it should be on your 4th slot every time. If you're against a 1-tank team, delaying it to 5th could make sense, and if you're against a 3-tank team, accelerating it to 3rd slot could even make sense sometimes. But of course, math is only so helpful when crafting a Smite build, as there's a lot of situational factors that a raw damage calculation or DPS number won't account for, such as how many additional cast cooldown reduction would give you in your average fight, how many deso procs you might get in a fight, how much you're maximizing your poly procs based on your god, etc. Basically, don't take this information as strict must-follow guidelines, but as a more general advice for your average game state that you can deviate from if you feel like something else will be better. If you have any questions or thoughts on any of this, leave a comment down below and I'll try to get to answering as many as I can, but that'll be it from me today. If you enjoyed the video and found it useful, then don't forget to drop a like before you leave and subscribe for more, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.